11:17 p.m., Reynolds Road, Columbus, Ohio. A black government SUV rolls through empty streets. Steady, clean, going nowhere fast, just home. Then the lights come on. Blue, red, rotating slow, like they have all the time in the world. Inside the SUV, one breath. Just one. Hands stay at 10 and 2. Don't move. Don't flinch. The man behind the wheel has crossed live minefields with less adrenaline than this. And he knows exactly what this moment requires. Everything. The officer reaches the window, flashlight straight into his face. No greeting, no good evening. Just doesn't mean you're above the law. The man in the SUV hadn't said he was, but the officer opens the door anyway, without permission, without cause, without hesitation. And right there is the moment a 17-year career begins to collapse. He just doesn't know it yet. He had survived 2 deployments overseas, 24 years in uniform, decisions that cost lives and saved them in the same breath. And the hardest thing he faced was a Tuesday night on Reynolds Road, and a man with a badge who looked right through him. Columbus in January does something to the air. It goes still, not peaceful still, empty still, like the city held its breath somewhere around dusk and forgot to exhale. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives and stays. Everett Gaines didn't mind the cold. He'd spent enough years in places where weather was the least dangerous thing around, where you learned to read silence, where the difference between nothing happening and nothing happening yet was a distinction worth your life. Ohio in winter was just Ohio in winter. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, both hands, 10 and 2. Watched the yellow center lines disappear under the hood of the black government SUV, one after another, steady as a pulse. The meeting at Wright-Patterson had run long. 2 hours past schedule. A room full of people talk for 90 minutes before someone finally said it plainly. Gaines had sat at the far end of the table, listened, waited, then said what needed saying in 4 sentences and watched the room adjust to it. He was good at that. 24 years teaches a man economy, not just with words, with everything, energy, anger, trust. You learn what's worth spending and what isn't. You get precise about it the way a carpenter gets precise about measurements. Because the cost of being wrong is something you've already calculated. He hadn't eaten since noon. A granola bar sat untouched in the passenger seat bag, 60 miles of ignoring it behind him. His back was stiff from the drive. His eyes were dry from the heat through the vents. He was 47 years old and tired in the specific way that comes from doing something you believe in for a very long time. But he wasn't unhappy. That was what people misread about Everett Gaines. The stillness, the quiet that lived on his face even in the middle of a crowded room. They saw it and decided he was hard to reach. Guarded, maybe cold. They weren't entirely wrong about the guard. They were wrong about what was behind it. He turned onto Reynolds Road at 11:17. The streetlights threw long orange shadows across the asphalt. A few other cars moving in the opposite direction. Not many. The traffic of people who already made it somewhere warm. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't weaving. He was driving home. Boyd Rucker had been sitting in the same spot for just over 2 hours. Tucked just off Reynolds, nose angled toward the road, engine idling, heat turned all the way up. The kind of night where you park somewhere and tell yourself you're watching for something, when really you're watching a shift that won't end soon enough. 43 years old. 17 years on the job. He'd accumulated enough experience to stop being surprised by most things and start being bored by them instead. The radio had gone quiet since 9. He'd finished his coffee before 10. Now he was half watching the road and half somewhere else in Sinai's entirely. The gig when the night refuses to offer anything worth your attention. A truck went by. A minivan with one working taillight, and then the black SUV with the government plates. Rucker didn't think. Not exactly. It wasn't a thought. It was a reflex, the same nudge that had moved his hand toward his keys so many times before that the motion had stopped requiring a reason. He pulled out. The lights came on. Inside the SUV, Gaines saw the flash in his rearview mirror before he'd formed a question about it. blue and red, rotating slow. He let out one breath, just one, measured. Then he put his signal on, which was almost ironic on an empty road, but that was who he was, and eased the SUV to the shoulder with both hands on the wheel, and his mind already doing the thing it did in situations like this. Calculating, hands visible, movement slow, voice flat. Don't give anyone a reason. Don't let them make you give them one. He'd learned that before he'd a rank, before he had a record, before he had anything except the body he'd been born into, and the particular math that those two things made together. The patrol car door opened hard, slammed. Gaines watched in the side mirror as Rucker approached, one hand loose at his hip. Flashlight up. Not rushing, not cautious. The walk of a man who expected the same outcome from this stop that he'd gotten from the last 100. He came to the driver's window. Gaines rolled it down halfway. Lice and registration. No greeting. No good evening, sir. Just the command, flat and immediate, like a man who didn't see the point in whatever came before it. Gaines kept his voice even. Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped? Rucker shone the light directly into his face. You were drifting between lanes. Looked like possible impairment. Gaines didn't blink. He'd been in the same lane for 6 miles. He knew it. Rucker had been watching him for maybe 30 seconds before pulling out. I understand, Gaines said. Let me get my documents. He moved slowly. Opened the glove box the way you open things when someone is watching your hands very carefully. Found the registration. Found his license. Added without rush. That's a government vehicle. I'm active-duty military. Rucker looked at the license. Looked at the registration. A pause. Military, yes. Something that wasn't quite a laugh. Not quite a scoff. Somewhere between the two. Doesn't mean you're above the law. I never said I was. And there it was. That was the moment. Gaines felt it before he could name it. The small shift in Rucker's weight. The way something tightened in his voice that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Not anger exactly. More like adjustment. The recalibration of a man whose script had just been ignored. Step out of the vehicle. Gaines paused. Half a second. I'm sorry? Step out of the car. I'm conducting a sobriety checks. On what grounds? I've complied with everything you've asked. I haven't been drinking. I'd like to understand the reason. You're refusing a lawful order. I'm asking for clarification, Gaines said. Same tone, same volume, like reading coordinates off a map. That's not refusal. Rucker reached for the door handle, opened it himself. Sir, out of the vehicle now. Gaines didn't move for 1 full second. 1. Not defiance, not fear, calculation. He was measuring the situation the way he'd measured 100 situations in worse places than this. The options, the costs, the irreversible ones, and the reversible ones. Then he reached slowly into his jacket pocket. I'm going to record this interaction, he said. He held the phone so Rucker could see exactly what he was doing with it. So we have an accurate record. For both of us. Rucker's eyes went to the phone. Something moved across his face. Fast. Gone before it could settle into anything he'd have to own. Get out of the car. Gaines stepped out. He was 6 feet even. Stood straight without effort. The posture of a man whose body had been trained long enough that was no longer a decision. It was just the shape he took up in a room. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't submissive. He was simply present in a way that made the air around him feel different. Rucker looked at him, and for one moment, just one, something in the back of Rucker's mind asked a question it didn't have an answer to. The rest of him was louder. Walk the line. He pointed to the sidewalk under the nearest light, heel to toe, arms at your sides. Gaines did it. No stumble, no sway, perfectly straight. The walk of a man who had crossed worse terrain than a stretch of Columbus sidewalk in January. He turned, walked back. He passed, obviously. Rucker wrote the citation anyway. Failure to maintain lane. He held it out without quite meeting Gaines's eyes. Gaines took it, looked at it once, then looked at Rucker. Not with anger, with something that lived underneath anger. Something quieter and more durable. Recognition. He'd seen something tonight, in Rucker's face. in the reflex of that hand reaching for the door handle, in the way Rucker had looked at him and made a decision about him before he'd said a single word. He'd seen it before, many times, in many forms, but he'd also seen something else just now, Rucker's face, the shape of it. The jaw, the way he held himself. Gaines had seen that face before, too. Not tonight, not on this road. Somewhere else. Somewhere with better light and different circumstances, and a handshake between them and both of them, smiling. He didn't say it. Not yet. He got back in the SUV, pulled onto Reynolds Road, drove into the dark at a steady speed with both hands on the wheel. The citation sat on the passenger seat. He didn't look at it again. Rucker drove back to the station, feeling the way he usually felt after a routine stop. Which is to say, not much. He logged the citation, wrote the report, failure to maintain lane, possible impairment, no arrest made. He kept it short, the way he always kept it short. Then he unclipped the body camera at the end of his shift and set it in the charging dock with the ease of a man depositing something he was finished with. Camera was acting up again, he said to the room. Not to anyone in particular, just said it, loud enough. Officer Dale Merritt looked up from his desk. What? Footage is going to be choppy. Third time this month. Rucker shrugged in a way that closed the subject. I'll file the equipment report. Merritt nodded. I went back to his paperwork, but something snagged, small. The way a thread catches on a rough edge and holds without you noticing until you've walked 10 feet and feel the pull. He didn't know what it was yet. He'd remember later. Rucker settled into the break room the following morning with coffee and the comfortable ease of a man back in familiar territory. Calloway was at the table. Diaz was refilling his mug, the kind of morning that moved at its own pace and asked nothing urgent of anyone. Had a stop last night, Rucker said. Not with much investment, the way you mention weather. Fed employee. Tried to pull rank. Calloway looked up. Yeah? Flashed military ID like that was going to change something. Rucker reached for the chips. Guy's name was Gaines, Everett Gaines. Calloway's mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Rucker noticed. 17 years of noticing things. What nothing? Just Calloway, just a mug down. You know that name? Should I? He came in maybe 4 years ago. Community Foundation thing. Did a whole presentation. Medals, the whole deal. A pause that had a specific weight to it. Bronze Star, Rucker. Rucker waved it off. Don't care what he's got. On that road, I'm the authority. Calloway didn't say anything else. Not another word. And that was the thing that stayed with Rucker longer than any argument would have. Not a disagreement. Not a challenge. Just a man deciding the conversation wasn't worth having anymore. Rucker ignored the feeling it left. He was efficient at that. Had been for years. The hotel room at 11:05 p.m. Also the specific silence of a place that had no stake in what had just happened. Gaines sat on the edge of the bed with his jacket still on and the lamp on low. The sighteen was on the nightstand. He looked at it the way he looked at problems worth understanding before deciding what to do with them. Then he pulled out the notebook. Small, black cover, spiral bound. He'd carried something like it for over decades. Notebooks, same habit. You write it down while you still know exactly what happened. Before the details soften, before your memory starts negotiating with itself, before what you felt starts rewriting what you saw. He wrote the time, 11:17 p.m., the location, Reynolds Road, eastbound approximately 4 miles east of Prescott. Badge number from the citation. Sergeant Boyd Rucker. Badge 1142, he wrote what was said. As close to verbatim as memory would hold. The sequence. The escalation. The specific moment Rucker's hand went to the door handle without invitation. He wrote, phone footage exists. Begin chain of custody documentation immediately. Then he sat back, looked at the ceiling. His son, Terrell, was at Ohio State. 19 years old, probably still awake. That was the thing about college. The hours has inverted themselves. But Gaines wasn't ready to explain this yet. Not because it was complicated. Because explaining it required a version of himself that had more distance from the moment than he currently did. He needed to stay in it a little longer. He needed to remember exactly what it felt like. Not the anger. The anger was present. He wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But underneath the anger, Sabi was something that had been built for longer with it. Something that had a different weight. He had looked at Boyd Rucker's face when the citation was handed over, and he had recognized two things simultaneously. The first, the expression of a man who expected no consequences, not arrogance. Habit. The settled consciences of someone who had done this before and lived inside a system that had never required him to reckon with it. The second, the face itself. He turned the notebook to a clean page and wrote one more line. Recognized the officer from a prior event. Community Foundation, approximately 4 years ago. Photograph exists. Confirmed details. He capped the pen. The meeting at Wright-Patterson felt like it belonged to a different day entirely. The granola bar from the passenger seat was now on the nightstand next to the citation. He still hadn't opened it. He thought about the 5 people on that road before him, the ones without a notebook. Without the training to write it down before the edges blurred. Without a colleague who could give them a lawyer's name on a Tuesday. He thought about how many of them had taken the citation home and swallowed what came with it. Not because they weren't angry. Because the cost of saying something had always been higher than the cost of staying quiet. He picked up the pen again, kept writing until he had everything. The next morning, Gaines made 2 calls before he touched the granola bar. The first was to the JAG office. Concise, factual. He gave the name, the badge number, the time and location, and a summary of the stop. He mentioned the citation, the phone footage. The body camera malfunction report, he expected, was already filed. "Do you want to pursue this formally, Colonel?" "Yes," Gaines said. No pause, no deliberation. The decision had been made somewhere between writing the last line in that notebook and turning off the light. The second call went to a number he'd held on to for 6 months without expecting to use it. A colleague had handed it to him after a conference. Attorney Dolores Fitch. Columbus area. Civil rights. "If you ever need someone who knows how this actually works," the colleague had said, "she's the one." He left a message on her voicemail. Clear, brief. His name, his rank, the date of the incidents, and a sentence. "I have documentation." Then he ate the granola bar, checked out of the hotel, got back in the SUV, and drove toward Fort Carson. He drove the same way he always drove. Steady, both hands, no hurry. The highway opened up ahead of him, and the sky over Oahu gray and flat and entirely honest about what it was. The citation was folded in his jacket pocket. He wasn't going to let it stay a piece of paper. Back in Columbus, Dale Merritt was at his desk for the morning shift. He'd slept on the thing that snagged at him the night before. Sometimes sleep clarified nothing, and sometimes it did exactly what it was supposed to do. This time it did its job. He knew what the thread was. 4 months ago, the city had installed traffic infrastructure cameras along Reynolds Road as part of a grant program. Nobody paid much attention to them. They weren't for surveillance. They captured traffic patterns, accident documentation. Nobody watched them live. But they recorded, continuously. He sat at his desk and thought about the northeast corner of Reynolds and Prescott. He thought about what the angle from that corner captured on a clear night. He thought about the timestamp on the citation Rucker had logged, 11:17 p.m., and the specific stretch of Reynolds Road that Rucker liked to park on during night shifts. He sat with it. He wasn't the kind of person who moved fast on things that had this much gravity. 6 years on the force had taught him to think before he acted, especially when what he was thinking about involved someone he worked with. But 6 years had also been long enough to understand something else. Not doing anything was also a choice. It just came with different consequences. He pulled up the city's infrastructure camera registry on his computer, found the northeast corner of Reynolds and Prescott, confirmed the camera had been operational since October. He opened a formal request form for footage access, filled it in, filed it through the correct channel, cited routine case review. It would take until Friday. He could wait until Friday. He went back to the rest of his morning. Rucker, 2 discs away, was writing a different report entirely and didn't look over. And in a government vehicle moving steadily west on a gray January highway, Everett Gaines was thinking about a face he'd seen in better light 4 years ago. A hand extended, a photograph, a smile that had meant something at the time. He was thinking about how far that was from Reynolds Road at 11:17 p.m. and how close. Fitch called back on a Wednesday. 8 days after the stop, Gaines was at his desk at Fort Carson when his phone rang. He picked up on the second ring. She asked 3 questions in the first 90 seconds, and he understood immediately that she was someone who didn't ask questions. She didn't already have a framework for answering. They arranged to meet the following Monday. Gaines drove up to Columbus the Sunday night before, 17 hours, which he broke into 2 legs with a stop in Indianapolis. He didn't mind long drives. They were one of the few places where nothing was required of him except to keep moving forward. He arrived at her office on a gray Monday morning with the notebook in his jacket pocket and the phone footage transferred to a certified copy on a separate drive. Dolores Fitch had a rule about first meetings. She didn't form conclusions until she'd watched how someone handled the moment after they said something hard. Not the saying of it, the after. The breath that followed, whether they rushed to fill it or let it stand on its own weight. Most people filled it. The need to be understood crowding out the discipline to let the truth sit there without help. Everett Gaines didn't do that. He sat across from her in the client chair, slight too low for the desk, which she'd never gotten around to replacing in 11 years, and he waited, like a man who had learned that silence wasn't empty. It was where the real information lived, if you were patient enough to stay in it. She'd read the notebook twice before she said anything. Then she pushed it back across the desk. You wrote this the same night. Yes, before speaking to anyone about the incident. Before anyone. She took her glasses off. Set them on top of a stack of folders. Do you know how rare that is? I know how important it is. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmly exactly, but with the specific acknowledgement of someone who has just heard the distinction they didn't expect. She didn't give those out often. Tell me about the photograph, she said. She'd found it herself. 40 minutes on the Citation's archived event page, cross-referencing the name from his documentation. 4 years old, a community ceremony. Rucker and Gaines side by side, both facing the camera. Rucker's hand extended, Gaines shaking it. Both men smiling in the uncomplicated way of an occasion that asked nothing difficult of either of them. Gaines was quiet for a moment. What he did on Reynolds Road was wrong whether he knew me or not, he said. That was true the second it happened. The photograph doesn't change what he did, but you're telling me now, because you need to know everything, and because the photograph matters, just not in the way people might assume. What way is that? He looked at her steadily. It shows he's capable of seeing me as a person when the circumstances make it convenient. She picked up her pen, wrote something he couldn't read from across the desk. Most people would have led with that the night of the stop. The irony is compelling. I know. Why didn't you? He thought about it the way he thought about things that deserved the time. Because I didn't want better treatment because of who I was. I wanted to see what he'd do when he thought I was nobody. She stopped writing. Looked up. All right, she said. Then let's make sure what he showed you becomes part of the permanent record. She put her glasses back on and reached for the first of what would become a very tall stack of folders. They worked for 2 hours without stopping. She was methodical in a way that looked like stillness from the outside and was the opposite from inside. Every form filed through its correct channel. The Inspector General's office, the department's Civilian Review Board, the Court of Public Record. She didn't do it for noise or speed. She did it for permanence. She'd had one case 8 years ago. A righteous case, an obvious case, a case where everyone in the room knew the truth. That collapsed because a single piece of paperwork had a gap in it the width of 2 fingers. and this other side had put their hands straight through it. She didn't have gaps anymore. She built cases the way engineers built bridges, not assuming the load would be light, assuming it would be as heavy as it could possibly get, and building for that weight from the start. When Gaines left her office that afternoon, he walked past the reception desk and down the stairs and out into the February, cold without stopping. She watched him from her window, the way he moved through the street. Steady, unhurried, no different from how he'd walked in. She went back to her desk, opened a new folder, wrote Gaines E across the tab in her precise, narrow handwriting, added it to the stack. Then she pulled out the City Foundation event page she'd printed that morning. Looked at the photograph one more time. Two men, a handshake, both smiling. She paper-clipped it to the inside cover of the folder. Evidence, she wrote beneath it. Relationship prior to incident. Use last. She closed the folder, got back to work. The call from Dale Merritt came on a Tuesday morning 10 days after the stop. Unknown number. Columbus area code. Fitch had 17 items on her desk and a deposition at 2. She almost sent it to voicemail. She took it. He was careful. The kind of careful that told her he'd thought about whether to call for longer than the call itself would take. I work with Rucker, he said. I'm not calling to cause trouble. Why are you calling? A pause. Because I looked at something I can't unlook at. She sat down. Tell me. He told her about the city infrastructure camera on the northeast corner of Reynolds and Prescott, installed 4 months before the incident. Continuous recording. He'd submitted an official footage request the week of the stop, received the footage 2 days later, watched it alone at his desk during a quiet hour. He described what it showed. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Is the footage still in official custody?" "Yes. Logged and certified. I submitted it through the proper request channel. There's a full documentation trail. And you're willing to speak to this in a formal proceeding." The pause was longer this time, long enough that she didn't fill it. "I'm willing to speak to what I saw," he said. "The footage handles the rest." She thanked him, hung up, sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she opened a new folder, wrote Merity across the tab, and added it to the stack beside the others. The stack was getting tall. Good. But Merritt had something else. It came the following morning. An email, attached document. Almost an afterthought in the way it was mentioned, just a line at the end of a follow-up message. Thought you might also want to see this. 5 complaint files. Internal department records, each one naming Boyd Rucker, each one spanning across a 6-year window, each one filed, logged, formally acknowledged, and then buried in the administrative equivalent of a room with no door. Not investigated and cleared, not dismissed with a stated reason, just absorbed, the way institutions absorbed things they'd rather not look at directly. Fitch read all 5. Then she read them again. The names on the complaints were ordinary names, the kind history forgot unless you were specifically looking for them. A man on the west side who reported Rucker had used a word he couldn't prove in court. A woman whose car had been searched without cause, found entirely clean, who'd filed and then heard nothing back. 3 others, different details, different years, same shape, and on 4 of the 5 as reviewing officer, as to signature at the bottom of the no further action required memo, the name Owen Strick. She sat very still, which was unusual for her. She was thinking about what this case was actually about, not what it had started as, not one traffic stop on Reynolds Road, but what it had become in the 10 days since Gaines walked into her office with a notebook and a phone and the calm of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. She called Gaines that evening. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Hear all of it before you respond." "All right." She told him about the 5 complaints, about Strick's name on 4 of them, about what it meant for this case to exist not as an isolated event, but as one documented instance in a pattern that someone had made consistent institutional effort to disappear. Silence on his end. "Colonel, I heard you. This is bigger than one stop. I know that. It changes the scope of what we're arguing. The Dolores. He said her name the way he said things that mattered. Quietly, without performance. I'm thinking about the 5 people on those forms, not about me. She stopped, because there wasn't a response to that worth saying out loud. Keep going, he said. What do you need? She picked up her pen. They worked for another hour. At the Columbus Police Department, the atmosphere changed in ways that were difficult to document but impossible to miss. Rucker received his notification of formal internal affairs inquiry on a Thursday. Captain Owen Strick called him in that same afternoon. Door shut. Blinds down. Strick was 56 years old and looked in that moment like a man who had been carrying a specific kind of weight for long enough that his body had started to show the shape of it. Sit down, Boyd. Rucker sat, arms crossed, the posture of a man who had decided the outcome of this conversation before it started. The man you stopped, Gaines. What about him? He filed a formal complaint, civil rights violation, unlawful detainment, abuse of authority. Strick set a folder on the desk between them. This came from the Inspector General's office. Ruck looked at the folder. He can't be serious. He's entirely serious. Strick's voice had no temper in it. Boyd, do you know his rank? He said, Miller Colonel. 24 years of service, the size, Bronze Star, a pause. He does not file things impulsively. He was uncooperative. He questioned every. The city has traffic cameras on zonal. Silence. Rucker went still. Not the stillness of a man who was calm. The stillness of a man who had just felt the floor shift under him and was waiting to understand how far it would go. The infrastructure cameras, he said. Yes. He hadn't thought about the infrastructure cameras. Of course I hadn't. And now sitting in Strick's office with the blinds pulled and the folder between them on the desk, Rucker felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. He'd felt it before. Early in his career, maybe. When things still had the capacity to surprise him. It was the feeling of a structure that might not hold. What happens now, he said. Not asking. Testing. Checking whether the word "we" was still available to him in this room. Strick was quiet for a moment that told its own story. We respond to the inquiry, he said. We cooperate with the review. Another pause. And Boyd, you need to get yourself a lawyer. Rucker looked at the folder, didn't touch it. I followed procedure, he said. Strick didn't answer. The silence that followed was the most specific thing Strick had said all afternoon. The station had its own way of registering these shifts. Nobody announced anything. Nobody held a meeting. But the locker room had a different quality to it after that Thursday. Conversations that found their natural end a beat earlier than usual, Rucker walked. Eye contact that landed just to the left of his face. Calloway, who had eaten lunch with him for going on 4 years, developed a schedule that never quite lined up anymore. Rucker didn't acknowledge any of it directly. He carried himself the same. Same walk, same expression in the hallways, same efficiency with the paperwork. But he felt the room. He'd always been good at feeling rooms. It was one of the things that had made him effective for 17 years. The ability to read the invisible architecture of a space, who had power, who was waiting to see which way things fell, who had already decided. Now he was on the wrong side of that reading. He didn't know what to do with that yet. So he did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with. He set steps aside and kept moving. Gramscium Forsyth had handled 31 police misconduct cases across his career. He'd won 22 of them. He was not someone who alarmed easily or wasted energy on outcomes he couldn't influence. But when Rucker told him about the traffic camera footage, he put his pen down, picked it up, put it down again. You're certain it was running? I'm told it was operational, and Merritt has it. He went through official channels. It's in the documentation trail. Forsyth was quiet for a moment, longer than comfortable. Then, all right, here's where we stand. You had discretionary grounds for the stop. The field sobriety test was conducted within procedure. The citation was issued. None of this is outside your authority. The footage shows how I approached the vehicle. The footage shows one angle of a dynamic situation. Forsyth's voice was steady, practiced. The voice of someone who had argued worse cases from worse positions. What I need you to do is stop thinking about what's on that footage and start thinking about your reasoning in the moment. Every action you took had a justification. I need you to know those justifications clearly and specifically, because that is what we are going to argue. Rucker looked at the table between them. Boyd, I heard you. What was your reasons for asking him to exit the vehicle? And here was the place it got complicated. Because Rucker knew the real answer. He'd have known it since Reynolds Road. Since the moment Gaines had looked at him with that specific quality of attention, not scared, not aggressive, just present and watchful and entirely unmoved by the badge and what it represented. And something in Rucker had reacted before his mind caught up with what it was reacting to. Gaines hadn't acted the way Rucker expected people to act. And Rucker had escalated of it. Not because of anything Gaines had done wrong. Because of what Gaines had refused to do, which was to be afraid. He was being evasive, Rucker said. Forsyth wrote it down. Rucker looked at his hands on the table and said nothing further. Owen Strick, meanwhile, had received his own correspondence from the Inspector General's office. Not about the Gaines stop specifically. About the prior complaints, about the review process that had generated 4 memos bearing his signature and produced no subsequent action. The memo from the IG used the phrase pattern of administrative response and requested a formal written account of his review methodology within 14 days. Strick read the memo at his desk with the door closed and the blinds angled down. He read it twice. He set it on his desk, looked out the window at the parking lot below. His car was in its usual spot. Spot 11. Same spot for 19 years. The view from this window on a February afternoon, bare trees at the far edge of the lot, the low-wood sky, the same cluster of vehicles that had been rotating through these spaces since before he'd made captain, was as familiar to him as the layout of his own living room. He'd looked this window after each of the 4 complaints. He'd told himself the same things each time. Insufficient grounds. The institution needs stability. Boyd performs well where it counts. You can't act on every complaint filed in frustration or bad faith. He'd told himself these things clearly and without visible hesitation and signed his name to the memos and filed them and moved on. And now he sat here with an IG memo on his desk that used the word pattern, and the thing he'd managed not to look at directly for 6 years was sitting directly in front of him with nowhere to go. He picked up the memo, read it a 3rd time. The names on the 4 complaint files came back to him. They always did, eventually, at certain times. Late nights, mornings when the station was quiet. He'd gotten good at moving past them quickly. Like reading a word you don't want to define and letting your eye skip forward to the next one. He sat there, and this time he didn't let his eye skip forward. He let the names sit there. He thought about what each complaint had actually described. Not the procedural language of the memos, the actual events. What the actual people had actually experienced and had tried to formally say something about and had been told, in effect, through the mechanism of his signature on a no further action required form, that what they experienced didn't rise to a level that merited anyone's attention. He was the one who had decided that. Not Rucker. Rucker had generated the events, but Strick had been the mechanism by which those events were made to disappear. He'd known that. He'd known it every time. He just hadn't let himself stay in the room with it long enough for it to mean anything. He put the memo in his desk drawer, closed it. He wasn't ready yet, but something had shifted. Something low and slow and below the surface of any decision he'd consciously made. The way a weight shifted in water. Not visible from outside, but changing the balance of everything above it. He looked at the parking lot for another minute. Then he picked up the phone. He didn't call the IG's office. He didn't call Forsyth. He didn't call Rucker. He called his wife. They talked for 11 minutes about nothing related to any of this. About dinner. About their son's drive back from visiting last weekend. About a pipe in the basement that was making a sound it hadn't made before. Ordinary things. He needed ordinary things for a few more minutes before the rest of it arrived. After he hung up, Siat sat in the quiet of his office for a long time. The drawer with the memo in it was closed. He looked at it. He was thinking about Gaines. Not about the case exactly. About the man. About the fact that Gaines come back to Columbus, had retained a lawyer, had walked into a formal proceeding with a notebook and a phone, a documented account of an 11 p.m. traffic stop, and had done all of it without shouting, without theater, without making it about anything except what it actually was. Strick thought about what it cost a person to do that, the precision of it, the discipline of staying inside the facts when everything in you wanted to say something larger about what the facts meant. He thought about how long Gaines had probably been doing that. Long before Reynolds Road, long before this case. The accumulated discipline of a man who had learned early and thoroughly that losing your composure gave other people the permission to dismiss you. He opened the drawer, took the memo back out, set it on the desk in front of him. He didn't sign anything that night. He didn't call anyone. He just left it at the desks when he turned off the light and went home. But he left it on the desk. That was different from putting it back in the drawer. 3 weeks had passed since Reynolds Road when Rucker found Gaines. He hadn't planned it. That was what he told himself. He'd been in the area. He'd driven past Fitch's building twice before he parked. He sat in the car for 11 minutes before he got out. The February afternoon was flat and gray and honest about what it was. Gaines came out of the building at 4:17. Collar up against the cold. Moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who'd finished something and was already thinking about what came next. He almost reached the sidewalk before he registered Rucker, leaning against the car at the curb. He slowed, stopped, 10 feet between them. Neither spoke for a moment. The street made its sounds around them. A bus. Voices from somewhere up the block. The ordinary noise of a city that had no interest in this particular exchange. Rucker straightened. He wasn't in uniform. Jeans and a dark jacket. He looked, without the badge, like a different version of himself. Not smaller exactly. Just more like a person's and less like a role. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said. "No, my attorney doesn't know I came. I assumed that." Rucker looked at the ground briefly, looked back up. He had the expression of a man whose prepared words had stopped fitting the actual room. "I thought if I apologized," he started. Stopped. "If I apologized privately and you withdrew the complaint." Another stop. "It would be better." Gaines looked at him. Not with anger. With something more leveling than anger. The steady, clear attention of a man who had already assessed the situation completely and was giving the other person the dignity of finishing their sentence before responding to it. "Is that an apology?" Gaines asked. "Or a proposal?" Rucker's jaw moved. "Both. Those aren't the same thing." "I know." A moment passed. The bus went by. The voices up the block faded. "Mr. Rucker," Gaines said. And the way he used the name, no rank, no officer, was deliberate without being cruel. It named exactly what this was. "I've been in the military for 24 years. I know what an apology looks like. And I know what someone offering me a deal looks like." A pause. "This is a deal." Rucker said nothing. "Go home," Gaines said. He walked past him, into the cold. Not quickly, not angrily, just directly. The walk of a man who had said what needed saying and was done. Behind him, he heard Rucker stand for a moment in the gray afternoon. He didn't look back. He heard, eventually, a car door open. Close. Drive away. He went back upstairs. Fitch looked up when he walked back through her office door. "Surprised. You forgot something." Rucker was outside. She put her pen down with the deliberateness of someone controlling their reaction. Outside this building. He wanted to propose a private apology in exchange for withdrawal. The expression on her face moved through several things in quick succession. Professional concern. Alarm about the ethics of direct contact. And beneath both of those, something she kept contained but couldn't entirely extinguish. the grim, specific satisfaction of a case that kept proving its own thesis. "Tell me everything," he said. "Exact words, if you have them," he told her. She wrote all of it down. "This is a significant problem for him," she said when he finished. "Direct contact with opposing party without counsels present. Forsyth is going to be very unhappy, I imagine." She looked at him over her glasses. "How do you feel?" He sat down in the low chair. He looked tired, he said. "Not sorry. Tired. Like a man who's been carrying something without knowing how heavy it was until he had to hold it standing still." Fitch considered that. "Does that change anything for you?" "No." He paused. "But it means he knows. Somewhere under all of it, he knows." She nodded slowly. "That's more than most of them get to." She turned back to her notes. "Let's keep going." Gaines, 4 days later, called Terrell. He'd been putting it off, not because he didn't want to talk to his son, because every time he'd picked up the phone in the day since the stop, he'd felt the gap between what he could say in a phone call and what the thing actually was. And he hadn't wanted to hand Terrell a reduced version of it. Terrell picked up on the second ring. "Dad, how are you doing?" "I'm fine. You?" "I'm okay." A pause that both of them recognized. "I need to tell you something," he told him. All of it. The drive back from Wright-Patterson, Reynolds Road. Rucker, the citation, the notebook, Fitch, the 5 complaint files, Merritt and the camera footage, the encounter outside Fitch's office. Terrell listened without interrupting, which was something Gaines had tried to teach him and was glad had taken. When he finished, Terrell was quiet for a moment. "Dad." "Yeah, why didn't you call me sooner?" "Because I needed to understand it myself first, before I handed it to you." Another pause. "Are you angry?" Terrell asked. "I was." He thought about how to say the rest of it. "Now, I'm just clear. What does that mean?" "It means exactly what happened, and exactly what I'm going to do about it, and exactly why." He paused. "The anger doesn't tell me anything the clarity doesn't already know." Terrell was quiet again. The thoughtful kind of quiet, not the uncertain kind. "Is it scary?" he asked. "Going to court?" "No." "Why not?" Gaines looked at the notebook on the desk in front of him, at the pages he'd filled on the night it happened and the days after, at the documentation that now existed in certified copies in 3 separate offices. "Because I've already done the work," he said. "The courtroom is just where the work gets presented." Terrell made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "You make everything sound like a logistics problem." "Most things are, Dad. Yeah, I want to be there. When it goes to trial." Gaines was quiet for a moment. "Then I know. Is that a yes?" "It's not a no." Terrell laughed for real this time. Short, real, his mother's laugh, the rhythm of it. "I'm coming," he said. Gaines didn't argue. He already knew he wasn't going to. The night before trial, he sat at the desk in his Columbus hotel room with the notebook open in front of him. He didn't write anything new. Everything was already there. Every second of Reynolds Road, every word in sequence. The document chain that stretched from a hotel room at 11:45 p.m. in January to certified copies in Fitch's files and these IG's office and the court record. He closed it, set it on the nightstand, turned off the lamp. The room went dark. The seats made its sounds outside the window. Somewhere below, someone was laughing at something. A door opened and closed. A television murmured from the floor above. He lay in the dark and thought about Owen Strick. Not with anger, with something more like curiosity. He'd been trying to understand Strick since Fitch had told him about the 4 signed memos. The man had been at the department for 19 years. He'd known what those complaint files were. He'd signed his name to the decision to put them away. That wasn't the action of a man who didn't know. It was the action of a man who had decided that knowing and acting on what you knew were 2 different obligations, and had chosen every single time which one was easier. Gaines understood that choice. He'd seen versions of it in every institution he'd ever been part of. The careful, accumulated weight of not rocking a boat that was carrying you somewhere comfortable. What he couldn't see yet was what would make Strick decide differently. He didn't try to predict it. He was good at not borrowing tomorrow's problems. He closed his eyes. Outside, Columbus kept its sounds. He slept. The morning of the trial, Everett Gaines wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray wool sweater, a coat that was practical rather than impressive. He'd made the choice the night before. Turned it over the same way he turned over every decision worth making. He could have worn his dress uniform, the medals, the rank, the full weight of 24 years made visible on his chest. He knew what that did to a room. How the symbols landed before a word was spoken. He'd watched it happen to other people. He understood the mechanics of it. But that wasn't how he wanted to win. He wanted to win as a man. Not as a rank, not as a collection of commendations that argued, look how much he's worth, before anyone had heard a single thing he had to say. He wanted 12 people in that jury box to see a person who had treated as less than one, and understand what that meant without needing a uniform to pre-argue the point. So, civilian clothes, gray sweater, practical coat. He ate breakfast at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse. Eggs, toast, coffee, black. He read nothing, checked his phone once, put it face down on the table, left a good tip and walked the 2 blocks in the cold. Pushed open the courthouse door. Terrell was already inside, sitting in the gallery's second row, still in the coat he'd worn on the drive from campus. He stood when he saw his father, didn't say anything, just stood. Gaines stopped, looked at his son for a moment. Then he put one hand briefly on Terrell's shoulder. "Sit in the back," he said quietly. "You'll see better from the back." Terrell nodded and moved without argument. Gaines walked toward the front of the room. The courtroom was smaller than expectation built it up to be. They always were. Dark wood panels that had absorbed decades of difficult mornings. Fluorescent lighting doing its best impression of something warmer. The smell of old carpet and coffee from somewhere down the hall, and the specific staleness of a room that had heard more hard truths than comfortable ones. Dolores Fitch was already at the plaintiff's table when Gaines arrived. She looked up, nodded once. No performance, no reassuring smile. Just, "We are here. We are ready. Let's do the work." He sat beside her. Across the aisle, Graham Forsythe was arranging his papers with the efficiency of a man who had done this every week for 20 years and needed no particular preparation to feel prepared. Rucker sat to his right, dark suit, and a tie he'd clearly had to think about. He looked like a man wearing the costume of a situation he hadn't fully accepted being inside. He didn't look at Gaines. Gaines didn't need him to. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Patricia Colwell entered and took the bench. She was 61 years old, with reading glasses she wore pushed down to the tip of her nose, and the general bearing of someone who had run out of patience for theater approximately 15 years ago, and now ran her courtroom on the efficient premise that everyone's time was equally limited. The trial began. Fitch opened without preamble. "On the night of January 14th, she said, standing at the center of the room, Lieutenant Colonel Everett Gaines was driving a government vehicle on Reynolds Road in Columbus, Ohio. He was not speeding. He was not weaving. He was not impaired in any way. He was driving home after a work meeting." She paused, let it sit. He was pulled over by Sergeant Boyd Rucker. What happened in the 22 minutes that followed is documented from 3 separate sources. We will show you all of them. Another pause. When you've seen everything, we're going to ask you one question. Not a complicated one. Just this. Was what happened to Everett Gaines on Reynolds Road acceptable? She sat down. Clean, no flourish. Forsythe rose. His opening was longer, more architecturally elaborate. Built on the language of discretion, officer safety, the genzilku of split-second decisions made in real time on dark roads. He used the word professionalism. He used the word procedure. He talked about the inherent ambiguities of a traffic stop at night and the reasonable latitude afforded to officers operating within those ambiguities. He didn't use the word wrong. Not once. The jury listened. Gaines listened too. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. He listened the way he listened to everything. Fully present, nothing sliding past. When Forsyth sat down, Colwell looked over her glasses at the room. Let's begin. The footage came first. Fitch played the phone video on the courtroom screen. Gaines had held the phone steady, steadier than most people could have managed in that situation and in that moment. The footage was clear. The audio was clear. Rucker's first words, no greeting, just the command. Gaines's response even, measured, entirely reasonable. The escalation, step by step. The light shone directly in his face, the demand to exit the vehicle. The door handle being reached from and pulled from outside before any refusal had been stated. The jury watched, no sound from the gallery. No shifting, no coughing. Then the traffic camera footage. This was different in a way that mattered. The phone footage was from Sis inside the situation, from the perspective of a man managing his own responses in real time. The traffic camera had no stake in the outcome. It was from the corner of Reynolds and Prescott. It had no reason to lie and no capacity for sympathy. It showed the patrol car pulling out from its spot. It showed Rucker's approach, the body language visible even at that resolution and distance. The hand that went to his hip before he'd reached the window. The posture of a man who had already decided what he was dealing with before he knew anything about what he was dealing with. And it showed Gaines, still, hands visible, moving with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what he needed to do to keep a situation from becoming something worse. You could see the door being opened from the outside. Fitch played that section twice. Forsyth didn't object to the second playing. Then she placed the certified copy of the notebook on the evidence table. Colonel Gaines wrote this account of the stop the same night it occurred, she said. Before he spoke to anyone, before he retained counsel, before he filed a complaint. She looked at the jury. This is what it looks like when someone is telling the truth and wants to make sure there's a record of it. She called Gaines to the stand. He walked up without hurry, settled into the chair, adjusted once, then looked at the jury with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a man who had nothing to manage because he had nothing to hide. Fitch walked him through it. The drive from Wright-Patterson. The turn onto Reynolds Road. The lights in the rearview mirror. Each question precise. Each answer matching exactly what he'd written in the notebook and what the footage showed. It's because they the same event, told the same way. Because they were true. When she finished, she said, "No further questions," and sat down. Forsyth stood. He came at it from the side. The way experienced lawyers came at things they couldn't attack directly. Not the facts. The frame around the facts. Colonel Gaines, you've had a distinguished military career. Yes, 2 overseas deployments. That's correct. And during those deployments, you was present for significant combat situations. Yes, 3 exchanges in, and Gaines could already see the shape of where this was going. It was emerging the way a structure emerged from fog. Slowly, then all at once. Colonel, have you ever been evaluated for or diagnosed with traumatic stress? The room changed. Not loudly, not with any visible drama. Just a shift in the quality of attention. The specific shift that happens when 12 people realize simultaneously that something significant just arrived. Fitch started to rise. Gaines placed his hand on the stand railing, quietly, calmly. "I'd like to answer that," he said. She sat back down. He looked first at Forsyth, then at the jury. "Yes," he said. "I have a diagnosis. I've been in treatment for several years. I'm going to assume the point of that question is to suggest my perception of what happened on Reynolds Road was distorted by prior experience. That I perceived a threat that wasn't there because of things I've seen in other places." Forsyth said nothing. Gaines continued. "I have been in places where authority had no limit. Where the people with the weapons decisions about who mattered based on factors that had nothing to do with behavior or law. Where the wrong person stepped you on the wrong road could end your life, and nothing would follow from it." He paused, measured, even. "That history does not make me irrational. It makes me precise. I know what I am looking at when I see power used without justification, because I have seen at very close range what that costs people." Another pause. Shorter. And I know the difference between a situation Officer Seas and Reynolds Road into Columbus, Ohio. What happened on Reynolds Road was wrong. Not because I was frightened, because it was wrong. Those are different things. The room held. Real silence. The kind that filled from the floor up and pressed against the ceiling. Forsyth said, "No further questions." He said it quickly, like a man who wanted to move on before that silence, something the jury would remember in the deliberation room. Rucker took the stand in the late afternoon. The light in the courtroom had shifted by then. The fluorescent overhead strip stayed constant, the way artificial light always stayed constant, indifferent to the hour. But the natural light coming through the windows on the east wall had gone from white to a flat gray that made the room feel slightly smaller, slightly more enclosed, which was fitting. He sat differently than Gaines had. Not worse, not with less composure, but differently in a way that told you something about the internal architecture of the two men. Where Gaines had settled into the witness chair with the ease of someone who had nothing to manage, Rucker sat with the quality of a man holding himself in position through effort. Still, contained, but working at it in a way that was faintly visible if you were watching closely. Forsyth walked him through the stop, the grounds for the pull, the decision to initiate, the approach to the vehicle, the request for license and registration, the field sobriety check and what had prompted it, the citation and the basis for it. Each step laid out in the clean procedural language they'd built together across 3 weeks of preparation. Rucker delivered it, competently, without stumbling. He knew the narrative. He'd said it enough times that sat in his mouth the way practiced things sat, available without effort. But Gaines, watching from the plaintiff's table, noticed something. Rucker never looked at the jury while he was answering Forsyth's questions once. He looked at Forsyth. He looked at the table. He looked occasionally at the judge, but his eyes didn't go to the 12 faces in the jury box. Not once. Gaines had seen that before. In briefings, in debriefs, in the specific kind of testimony that people don't give when they were reciting something accurate without believing it fully. He said nothing, made no note, just registered it. Then Fitch stood. She didn't move toward the witness stand immediately. She stood at the tips for a moment, looking at the folder in front of her, in a way that was deliberate, without being theatrical. The room adjusted to her pace. That was what happened when you didn't rush. The room came to you. Sergeant Rucker. Yes. Why did you initiate the stop on Reynolds Road on the night of January 14th? The vehicle appeared to be drifting between lanes. Appeared to be. Yes. For how long did you observe the vehicle before initiating the stop? A pause. Approximately 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, how many lane deviations did you observe? Another pause. Shorter. The vehicle moved toward the lane marker. Once? Yes. Did it cross the lane marker? It approached the marker. Did it cross it? No. And on the basis of one movement toward a lane marker, for a 30-second observation window, you initiated a traffic stop. It wasn't a question. Forsyth said. Objection. Argumentative. I'll rephrase, Fitch said. Sergeant Rucker. Is a single movement toward a lane marker, not crossing it, sufficient basis for a traffic stop under department guidelines? A pause that lasted long enough. It can be, depending on context. What context applied here? The time of night. The road conditions. The possibility of impairment. The possibility of impairment based on one-lane movement. Combined with the time of night. Yes. Fitch nodded slowly. She picked up a page from her folder, set it back down. The gesture of someone who had considered using something and decided the question itself was enough. Sergeant Rucker. Why did you ask Colonel Gaines to exit the vehicle? He appeared evasive. He appeared evasive. Yes. In what specific way? A pause. He was asking questions rather than complying with my requests. He was asking why he'd been stopped. Yes. Is asking why you've been stopped evidence of evasion? Another pause. Longer. Not by itself. Did Colonel Gaines raise his voice at any point during the stop? No. Did he make any threatening movement? No. Did he reach for anything without telling you first? He told me he was going to record the interaction. He told you. And then he held the phone up so you could see it. Yes. That's the opposite of a threatening movement. He was. Did he refuse to provide his license and registration? No. Did he fail to comply with any request you made? A pause. He asked for clarification before complying with the order to exit the vehicle. He asked why he was being asked to exit. Yes. And then he got out. Yes. So his compliance was delayed by one question. He was being difficult. The room was quiet for a moment. Fitch let it stay quiet. Sergeant Rucker, she said, and her voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It was the same voice she'd been using since she stood up. In your 17 years on the force, would you describe every driver who asked a clarifying question before complying as being difficult? Forsyth said. Objection. Calls for. Withdrawn, Fitch said. She turned to the exhibit table, picked up the photograph. She showed it to the jury first. Held it steady so all 12 faces could see it clearly. Let them look at it for a full 6 seconds before she brought it to Rucker. Sergeant Rucker, do you recognize this photograph? He looked at it. Something moved behind his eyes, not in his expression. The expression held. But behind it, something shifted, the way something shifted in water when a stone dropped in from above. Visibles not at the point of entry, but in the rings that spread outward from it. Yes, he said. Can you describe what's in it? It's me and Colonel Gaines, at a community event. When was this taken? Approximately 4 years ago. And in this photograph you are shaking Colonel Gaines's hand. Yes. Smiling. Yes. Both of you. Yes. She put the photograph down on the evidence table with the particular care of placing something where it would stay. Captain Strick testified this morning that Colonel Gaines is known within certain law enforcement circles for his community work. His record. His involvement with the foundation that held this event. She paused. Were you aware of any of that when you approached his vehicle on Reynolds Road? I didn't recognize him. I didn't ask if you recognized him. I asked if you were aware of his record and his work in the community. A pause. Not at the time of the stop. But you had met him. I didn't recognize him in the dark. You had stood beside him, shaken his hand, been photographed with him. I meet many people at community events. And yet, Fitch said, when you look at this photograph, taken 4 years before the night of January 14th, you recognize him immediately. In a well-lit courtroom, in the middle of a trial. You looked at this photograph 60 seconds ago and said, yes, that's me, that's Colonel Gaines. Rucker said nothing. So the question, Fitch said quietly, is not whether you were capable of recognizing him. The question is what you were looking at when you approached that vehicle on Reynolds Road, and whether you were looking closely enough to see who was there. Forsyth said, objection. Argumentative. Sustained, Colwell said. Move on, counselor. No further questions, Fitch said. She sat down. Forsyth declined redirect. Rucker stepped down from the stand and walked back to the defense table and sat. He placed his hands flat on the table in front of him, looked at them, then looked forward at nothing in particular. He didn't look at Gaines. He didn't look at the jury. He looked at the space between himself and the front of the room, and he sat very still in a way that what was no longer about managing appearances. The management had stopped somewhere during Fitch's cross-examination. What remained was just a man sitting with what he'd said and what the footage had shown and what the photograph meant and the specific arithmetic of all of it added together. Gaines watched him for a moment, then looked away. The afternoon session ended 20 minutes later. Judge Colwell announced that closing arguments would begin at 9 the following morning. She thanked the jury for their attention. She reminded both counsels of the procedural expectations for closing statements. Then she left the bench and the room began the slow process of emptying. Terrell was waiting in the corridor outside. He fell into step beside his father without speaking. They walked toward the exit, past the bulletin boards with their procedural notices and legal aid announcements, past the water fountain, and the elevator bank, and the wide glass doors that led to the February afternoon. "Tomorrow," Terrell said. "Not a question, just an acknowledgement." "Tomorrow," Gaines said. They pushed through the doors together. The cold hit immediately, clean and sharp. The sky above Columbus was the specific dark gray of late winter afternoons, the kind that was already thinking about evening, even though the hour hadn't earned it yet. They stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. "He can look at the jury," Terrell said. Gaines glanced at his son. "You noticed. Hard not to." Gaines was quiet for a moment. "It means he knows the story he's telling isn't the whole one." Terrell thought about that. Does he know it consciously? Some part of him does. Gaines looked out at the street. Whether he's ready to look at that part yet, that's a different question. They went to find dinner. Neither of them talked about the trial for the rest of the evening. There was nothing left to say about it. That the morning wouldn't answer better. The second morning of trial began the way the first had. Fitch at the plaintiff's table with her folders, arranged in the exact sequence she would use them, nothing left to chance or improvisation. Forsyth consulting in low tones with Rucker at the defense table. Judge Colwell not yet on the bench. The bailiff at his station with the crossword puzzle he'd been working on for 3 days tucked below the desk at an angle that was visible to anyone sitting a sightline, but that everyone had agreed through the unspoken courthouse convention of professional courtesy not to comment on. The gallery was fuller than it had been on day one. Word had moved in the way it moved about things that mattered to people who were paying attention. 2 of Gaines's coxswains from Fort Carson were in the second row, having driven through the night to be here. They'd called him the evening before to say they were coming. He'd told them it wasn't necessary. They'd come anyway. He hadn't argued. He knew what it meant when people showed up without being asked and didn't need to be thanked for it. A few faces from the department that Merritt recognized and didn't comment on. Civilians who had tracked the case through local coverage and decided it was worth a morning of their lives. A woman in the third row with a notebook open on her knee who Fitch had spotted and identified as a journalist from the city paper. Local only, so far. That could change depending on what happened today. Terrell was the back row where his father had asked him to sit. He had been given 3 weeks' notice of the court date. The official letter had arrived at Fort Carson on a Tuesday morning. Thin envelope. Plain return address from Lucas County Civil Court. Gaines had opened it at his desk between 2 other civil correspondents, read once, set it down, and told Sergeant Bates to arrange a vehicle for the drive to Columbus the Sunday before trial began. Bates had looked at the calendar. "Sir, that's a 17-hour drive." "I know. We could arrange a flight. There are direct routes from Colorado Springs to..." "The drive is fine, Bates." Bates had noted something on his pad, said nothing further. 4 years working alongside Everett Gaines had taught him which decisions had already been made before they were announced and which ones were still open. This one had already been made. The drive had given Gaines something flights couldn't. 17 hours across 3 states, broken into 2 legs with a night in Indianapolis, and the kind of thinking that only happened when the miles kept coming and the landscape kept changing and nothing was required of you except forward motion. He hadn't been preparing. The preparation was done. Fitch had seen to that with the same methodical precision she'd brought to every other piece of this case. What the drive gave him was something different. Specifics at settling that came from moving toward something at the right pace. Not rushing, not delaying. Just arriving when the road brought you there. He'd pulled into Columbus on Sunday evening feeling, if not calm in the ordinary sense, then ready in the way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having done every piece of work available to him. Now it was Tuesday morning, the second and final day of testimony, and nobody in the room knew yet what was about to come through the rear door. Gaines was looking at the folder on the table in front of him, not reading it. Just grounded himself in the physical object of it. The documents contain a chain of a night on Reynolds Road that had started in a hotel room at 11:45 p.m. and had ended up here, in this room, with these 12 people who were going to decide what it meant. He thought about the notebook in his jacket pocket. He carried it everywhere still. Habit. The same way he'd carried one for 20 years. The original pages from the night of January 14th were in certified copies in 3 separate offices now, but he still had the notebook itself. The actual object. The one he'd written in that night with the lamp on low and the hotel room quiet around him. He thought about that night, the specific quality of it. Sitting on the edge of the bed and writing before the edges of the memory had any chance to soften. Before his mind could begin the involuntary work of adjusting the sharpest details into something more comfortable to carry. He'd written it down because he believed that truth was a thing you had to protect, not from other people, from time, from the slow erosion of your own need to make sense of things in ways that let you sleep at night. He'd protected it, and now it was here. Fitch glanced at him. He gave her a small nod. She turned back to her notes. The rear door opened. Owen Strick walked in, not in uniform, a gray suit, dark tie, shoes that had been polished that morning. He walked with the deliberate forward motion of someone who had made a decision in private and was now executing it in public, and did not intend to waver between the two. He'd made the call the evening before, alone in his kitchen after dinner, with the IG memo on the table in front of him. It had been on his desk every day for 3 weeks, moved from the drawer to the desk surface and back, never more than arm's length. The presence of it had become its own kind of pressure, not external, nothing anyone was doing to him. Internal. The pressure of a thing you know that you are choosing not to act on, and the awareness of that choice accumulating day by day. He'd read it 4 more times over those 3 weeks. Each time he read it, he found himself thinking not about the procedural language, not about his own exposure or the IG timeline or what Forsyth might advise. He found himself thinking about the names on those 4 complaint files, the names that had passed through his office and his review process and had come out the other side as no further action required. Actual people. He'd met 2 of them briefly in the processing of the complaints, sat across a desk from them, listened to the asked the procedural questions, written his assessment, and then filed it. He'd told himself each time that his assessment was accurate, that the evidence was insufficient, that the complaint didn't rise to the level of formal action. He'd said these things clearly and without hesitation, and signed his name and closed the file. He'd been lying. Not to anyone else, to himself. With particular efficiency of a man who had practiced a certain kind of self-deception long enough that it had stopped requiring effort. The thing about the IG memo wasn't that it threatened him. He'd have found ways to manage that threat if the threat was all there was. The thing about the memo was that it used the word pattern. And the word pattern, sitting there on official letterhead, had finally done what 4 individuals hadn't managed to do so separately. It had made him see the shape of what he'd been doing, not 4 discrete decisions. One ongoing decision, made 4 times, with 4 different people on the receiving end of it. One ongoing decision with a name attached to it. His name. He'd called the court clerk's office after dinner and asked about the process for a voluntary witness. The clerk had explained it. He'd written down the steps. He'd followed them methodically, the same way he'd followed procedures his entire career, which was the particular irony of it. Using the same professional discipline that had made him good at burying things to now go and unbury one. He told his wife at breakfast. She'd looked at him across the table for a long moment, long enough that he could feel her deciding how to respond. Then she'd said, "It's about time." Not as a criticism, not as comfort. Just as an accurate observation delivered by a woman who had known him for 31 years and had her own opinions about various decisions he'd made across those years and had learned when to voice them and when to hold them. He hadn't slept well, that was expected. He hadn't slept well in 3 weeks. Now he walked past the gallery benches and said something quietly to the babe and waited while the clerk was summoned, and the clerk went to Colwell's chambers and came back. And Colwell emerged and then heard the request, and both counsels were approached. And Forsyth's expression moved through 3 distinct stages in about 4 seconds. Fitch had gone very still. Gaines was watching her face. He read the stillness, looked at the door, saw Strick. He looked at the man for a moment. Then he looked back at the table. He hadn't known this was coming. Fitch hadn't known. Nobody at the plaintiff's table had known. And yet sitting here now, with Strick standing at the front of the gallery waiting for the procedural steps to complete, Gaines felt something that wasn't surprise so much as recognition. The arrival of something that had been in motion for longer than anyone could track. The specific satisfaction of a structure reveals itself to be what it actually was. Colwell ruled in favor of hearing the testimony. Forsyth objected, at length, with the precise language of a man who understood that objecting strenuously was the only remaining move available, and that it would not succeed but needed to exist in the record. Colwell sustained her ruling. Forsyth sat. He looked at Rucker. Rucker was looking at the wall to his left. He had not moved since Strick walked in. He had not looked at the door. Had not looked at Strick. Had not looked at Forsyth. He was looking at the wall, and his hands were flat on the table, and his jaws was doing the small, almost imperceptible movement of a man who was working very hard to keep everything behind his face where it belonged. Strick took the stand. He walked past the defense table without looking at it. He sat in the witness chair, adjusted the microphone once, folded his hands on the railing, looked at the jury. Not at Rucker, not at Forsyth, not at Gaines, not at Fitch. At the 12 people who were going to have to make sense of all of this and decide what it meant and carry that decision back into their lives afterward. He looked at them the way you looked at people you owed something to. Fitch approached without a folder, without notes, without anything in her hands. Captain Strick, you requested to appear today as a voluntary witness. Yes. Why? He looked at his folded hands briefly, the gesture of a man gathering something. Then he looked back up. Because I've been signing my name to things for a long time, he said. And I've been telling myself it was institutional necessity. That handling certain plaints internally was how you protected the functioning of a department. That some matters were better managed quietly, without the exposure of formal proceedings, because the institution's stability required it. He paused. His voice was steady, not confessional in the performed sense, not reaching for emotion, just stating things clearly in sequence. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong about it for the better part of 6 years. And I thought, if I was going to be wrong in public across 6 years and 4 documented instances, I should at least be right in public once, while I still had the chance to be. The room was quiet. The ventilation above the ceiling tiles was audible. Captain, your name appears on 4 prior complaint files involving Sergeant Rucker as reviewing officer. Yes. In each of those 4 cases, you determined no further action was warranted. Yes. Was that an accurate determination? The pause was not dramatic. It was just the length of a breath held and then released. No, he said. It wasn't. Someone in the gallery made a sound, barely audible. The involuntary exhale of a person whose breath had something unexpected and then let go of it. Why did you make that determination? He looked at the jury when he answered this. Not at Fitch, not at the gallery, at the 12 faces. Because it was the path of least resistance, he said. The complaints came from people who lacked the resources or institutional standing to push back effectively against my determination. There was no external mechanism that required me to look further than I chose to look. So I didn't look further. Boyd Rucker performed his job effectively in every area that was easy to quantify and evaluate. I allowed those areas to absorb the weight of the areas that weren't. A pause, shorter. That was a decision I made every single time. It wasn't an oversight or an error of judgment. I knew what I was doing, and I chose to do it because it was simpler than the alternative. Fitch said, No further questions. She sat down. Forsyth took his time standing, the visible gathering of a man who was recalculating from scratch in real time. He approached the stand. He questioned the timing, the motivation, the convenient proximity of the voluntary testimony to the EG review that was already underway, and to which Strick's cooperation would presumably be relevant. He questioned whether the appearance today was in fact a strategic decision dressed in the language of conscience. He was not wrong to raise these questions. They were reasonable questions. They were the questions a good defense attorney was obligated to raise. Strick answered each one. He had followed official procedure to add himself to the witness list. His testimony concerned events within his direct personal knowledge and official capacity. He was not in communication with the IG office about the specifics of this testimony. He was not negotiating anything with anyone. "Captain Strick," Forsyth said, in the tone of a man arriving at his real question. "Is it possible, not certain, just possible, that your presence here today is primarily motivated by a desire to manage your own exposure in the Inspector General's review by demonstrating cooperation before that review produces its own findings?" Strick looked at him, not defensively, not with resistance of someone who has been caught, with the steadiness of someone who has already sat with this question in private and arrived at an answer they are prepared to carry. "It's possible you believe that," he said. "It isn't what's happening. How would anyone here know the difference?" A pause. "They wouldn't," Strick said. "Not with certainty, that's true." He looked at the jury. "What I know is that I'll carry whatever understanding I have of my own reasons for as long as I hold this position. I have carried the other thing for 6 years. I would rather carry this." Forsyth had nothing that would improve on that. He sat down. Rucker, across the aisle, had not moved throughout the entire examination, had not looked at Strick once. He sat with his hands flat forward, and the expression of a man who was somewhere so far inside himself that the room around him had become secondary to whatever was happening in there. Closings were that afternoon. Fitch stood at the railing of the jury box and looked at 12 faces and delivered what she had had to deliver. You have seen the footage, 2 sources, one from inside the situation, one from outside it, with no stake in the outcome. You have read the documentation, written the night the event occurred, before any legal process had begun. You have heard from the man this happened to, from the officer who found evidence that might have stayed buried and decided it should be part of the record, and from the captain who just told you, under oath in this room, that he made the wrong decision 4 times, across 6 years, and that he knew it. She paused. We are not here to ask whether Boy Rucker is a good person. That question is above the jurisdiction of any courtroom. We are asking whether what happened to Everett Gaines on Reynolds Road on the night of January 14th was acceptable, whether he had the right to be treated as a person during a lawful traffic stop, whether a pattern of behavior buried 4 times over 6 years by a supervisory officer who has now admitted under oath that those burials were wrong, whether all of that deserves to be part of the permanent public record. She looked at them one more time. Records matter. They're how we know what happened. They're how the next person stopped on a road like Reynolds Road has something to point it to when they need it. Something that says this was examined, this was judged, and this was wrong. She sat down. Forsyth's closing was everything a professional defense closing should be. Procedurally grounded, factually careful, built on every available foundation. He was good at his job. He was arguing uphill, and the jury could feel the grade. They were out for a day and a half. Gaines spent it in motion, walking the city in the morning, eating at reasonable hours, sleeping adequately both nights. Call once each evening, not about the case. He called Fort Carson once to check on a logistics matter that had nothing to do with Columbus and everything to do with maintaining the rhythm of the work that would be waiting for him when he got back. Fitch called. How are you holding up? Fine. You need anything? No. Whatever they decide. The record already exists, he said. That part already happened, regardless of what they decide. That's what I came here to do. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. It did. The call came on Thursday afternoon. He was in the hotel lobby with a newspaper. He folded it without finishing the article he'd been reading, put on his coat, walked the 2 blocks. The courtroom was quieter. Only the people who had been present throughout. Terrell in the back row, Merritt in the side aisle, the 2 colleagues from Fort Carson, still there, still silent. The journalist from the city paper with her notebook. Rucker was already seated. He looked different from the man who had sat at that table 3 days ago. The suit was the same, the tie was the same, but something structural had shifted. Not in his posture exactly, in the quality of his presence. Like a building, still had all its walls standing, but had lost things essential in the middle that had been holding everything else in relation to itself. He looked like a man who had been sitting with a very difficult truth for 36 hours and had not yet decided what to do with it. Judge Colwell entered, took the bench. The 4 persons stood, in the matter of Gaines's versus the City of Columbus and Sergeant Boyd Rucker. We did the jury find in favor of the plaintiff. We find that the plaintiff's constitutional rights were violated during an unlawful stop and detainment on Reginald's Road on the night of January 14th. We find that the actions of Sergeant Rucker were inconsistent with department policy and with the fundamental obligations of professional conduct in law enforcement. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $47,000. We recommend this case be referred to the Department of Justice for formal review of departmental complaint handling procedures and prior administrative decisions. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment, and this wasn't that kind of room. Gaines sat with it, fully. Let it arrive and settle without rushing it along. Not triumph, not relief in the uncomplicated sense that word usually carried. Something more precise than either of those things. The feeling of a sentence arriving at the word it had been building toward for 3 months. Accurate, complete, done in the right way. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then at his hands, then across the aisle at Rucker. Rucker had not moved. Forsythe was leaning in, speaking quietly, but Rucker wasn't tesracking the words. He was somewhere inside sat what had just happened. Not collapsed, not visibly broken, just present with it. For the first time in a way that looked genuine rather than managed. Gaines looked away. He didn't need to watch that. Outside, the February air was sharp and real and cold, in the way February in Ohio was always cold. Honestly, and without apology, just stating the fact of itself. Fitch stood beside him on the courthouse steps. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The city moved past below. Ordinary, continuous, people going to places they needed to be. You could have asked for more, she said. Damages. I know. The referral to justice is significant. A full review of how Strick handled those files. That process is going to reach some in situations we don't know about yet. People who never filed anything because they'd already learned it wouldn't go anywhere. Good, Gaines said. That's the part that matters most. She looked at him. The assessing look she'd had the first day he walked into her office. Whatever she was measuring, she'd been measuring it since January. Most people would have celebrated, she said. I'll celebrate when the review produces something. Almost a smile. The reluctant kind that cost her something to give. I'll send the final documentation to Fort Carson. Thank you, Delegors, for all of it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, went down the steps, and moved into the city and was gone. Terrell appeared at his father's shoulder. Didn't say anything, just stood in the cold, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on the street below. They stood there together for a moment. Long enough. Go find something to eat, Gaines said. I'll meet you in an hour. Terrell looked at him. Read the look. He was good at reading his father by now. Where are you going? One more thing. A pause. Then the nod, the specific nod of someone who understands something they haven't been told directly and has decided to trust it. 1 hour, Terrell said. He went down the steps. Gaines stood alone for another moment. The city spread below him in the gray afternoon light. He thought about the drive in front of him. 17 hours back to Fort Carson once this was done. He'd stop in Indianapolis again. He'd have the road and the miles, and the specific clarity that came from moving through open space at a steady pace with nothing required of you except to keep going forward. He'd have time to think about what came next. Not tonight. Tonight there was one more thing. He walked to his car. He knew the address. He'd looked it up 2 days ago and then decided to wait until after the verdict. Not because the verdict changed what he was going to say. Because he'd wanted to be finished with the official part before he did this. He'd wanted it to be separate from the legal proceedings. His own choice, his own time. The drive to the west side took 14 minutes. He parked across the street from the brick two-story and sat in the car for a moment, not second-guessing. He was done second-guessing. He was just sitting with the specific gravity of what he was about to do. Something that required more of him than anger ever had. More than the notebook, more than the complaint, more than sitting in that courtroom for 2 days and telling the truth clearly and without embellishment. This required something that didn't have a procedural name. He got out, crossed the street, walked up the front path, knocked. He heard movement inside. A pause. The house adjusting to the question of who was on the other side of its door. The door opened. Rucker. Still in the trial suit. Jacket gone. Tie pulled loose. Heat and changed. Had eaten by the look of him. He had the appearance of a man who had driven home and sat down somewhere and had not been able to locate a reason to do much else since. He stared at Gaines. Gaines looked back at him. The street was behind them. A car passed at the end of the block. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and stopped. "I'm not here to collect anything," Gaines said. Ruck's hand stayed on the door, not closing it, not opening it wider, holding it at the position it had arrived at when he opened it. "Then why are you here?" Gaines thought about how to say it. He'd turned it over on the drive across the city. The words he'd arranged had sounded like a speech, and he didn't want to give a speech. She had to say that it's the true thing in the plainest available form. "Because I've spent 24 years believing that people are capable of being more than their worst moment," he said. "And I'd be a hypocrite if I believed that about everyone except the person standing in front of me right now." Rucker's hand dropped from the door. "The verdict is done," Gaines said. "The record exists. The review is going to happen. None of that changes based on what you do next." He paused. "But what you do next is still your choice. That part hasn't been decided yet." Rucker looked at him. Something was happening in his face that he wasn't controlling. Not tears, not the dramatic arrival of visible remorse. Something quieter and more structural than that. The movement of a thing that had been held fixed for a long time and was now, slowly, becoming uncertain of its own position. Like a wall discovering it had been load-bearing and the load had shifted. "Most people don't get a moment this clear," Gaines said. "They don't have the thing they've been getting wrong laid out in a courtroom, with evidence and testimony, and 12 strangers deciding what it meant. That's a hard thing to go through. A pause. It's also something you can use, if you decide to." Rucker's jaw moved. He looked at the ground briefly, then back up. The look of a man who had several things to say and couldn't locate which one was the right one to say first. He didn't say any of them. Gaines didn't fill the silence. He let it stand there between them in the cold February air for the full length it needed. Then he said, simply, "You still have time." He turned, walked back down the front path, crossed the street, got in his car. He heard the front door close behind him, softly. The specific softness of a door closed by a person who chose to close it themselves rather than having it close for them. He sat in the car for a moment.
The street was quiet.
The gray afternoon light was thinning toward evening. He looked at the house for a moment. The porch light that was already on, even though it wasn't dark yet. Then he started the engine, pulled out, drove away. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't need to. What happened next in that house was Rucker's to decide. Gaines had said what he came to say. He'd meant every word of it, and he'd meant nothing beyond it. Not forgiveness offered, not absolution extended. Just one man telling another that the door was still open, that the time to walk through it hadn't run out yet. Whether Rucker walked through it was a question that belonged entirely to Rucker. Gaines drove. The city opened around him, and then the highway opened ahead of him, and he pointed the SUV west toward Indianapolis and the long, dark road home. He thought about the notebook in his jacket pocket. He thought about the night he'd written in it. The lamp on low. The hotel room quiet. The citation on the nightstand next to the granola bar he'd finally thrown away the next morning. He thought about the 5 complaint files and the names on them and the IG review that was now formally in motion. About the work that had just begun in the departments and offices his case had touched. About how long that work would take and how many people it would reach, and how most of them both would never know his name. That was fine. That was exactly how it was supposed to work. He thought about Terrell. About the drive his son had made from Columbus to Ohio State that morning, early before the verdict, because he had a class he hadn't wanted to miss, and his father had told him to go. About the text Terrell had sent at 1:30 that afternoon, 3 words, "How did it go?" Gaines had replied, "Good. Talk tonight." He'd call him from Indianapolis. He thought about Fort Carson, about the logistics review waiting on his desk, about the junior officers who would be at his door following Monday with questions about leadership that were really questions about how to be a person in an institution without becoming less of a person in the process, about the specific work of trying to build something in people that would outlast the immediate pressures bearing down on them, about how that work never finished. It just kept going. The highway stretched ahead of him, flat and long and visible all the way to the horizon. The sky above Ohio was dark now, the last light gone, and the stars weren't visible through the cloud cover, but they were there. He drove, both hands on the wheel. Steady pace. No hurry. He had the road, and the miles, and the quiet, and the particular clarity of a man who had done what needed doing, and was heading back toward the work that still waited. That was enough. It had always been enough. In Columbus, in a kitchen going dark with the evening, Boyd Rucker sat at his table. He'd closed the front door and stood in the hallway for a long time after Gaines drove away. Long enough that the quality of the light through the front windows changed from gray to the specific deep blue of early evening. Then he'd walked to the kitchen, sat down. At some point, he'd gotten up and gone to the drugstore 3 blocks over. He wasn't sure exactly when. He'd walked there in the cold without a coat because he hadn't thought to put one on. Bought one thing, walked back. A notebook, plain cover, spiral bound, the cheapest way a shelf. He sat at the table and looked at it for a while. He thought about what Gaines had said on the front step. Not the words, Tiggs, exactly. The quality of them. The absence of performance in them. The specific weight of something said by a man who meant exactly what he said and nothing beyond it, and had no interest in how it landed beyond the fact of its truth. He'd spent 17 years being certain of his read on situations, certain of his instincts, certain that the badge gave him an authority that was essentially self-validating, certain that the complaints that had come through Strick's office and gone away quietly, because they were insufficient, because they didn't rise to the level, because the system had evaluated them and found them wanting. He hadn't examined that certainty. He'd lived inside it, the way you lived inside a house you'd grown up in, without asking about the foundations, without asking what the walls were made of, just moving through it every day, room to room, taking the structure for granted. The footage from Reynolds Road had been the first crack. Not in his story. In the certainty underneath the story. He'd watched himself on that camera, from the outside, from the angle of something that had no stake in how he came across. And he'd watched himself approach that vehicle with his hand, already at his hip, before he knew anything about the driver. He'd watched himself shine a light in a compliant man's face. He'd watched himself open a door that belonged to someone else. He'd watched himself and not recognized immediately the man he was watching. That was the thing that had stayed with him across the 3 weeks since he'd first seen the footage. Not the legal exposure, not Forsyth's assessments, not even the verdict, but not recognizing. The gap between who he'd believed himself to be and who he'd watched himself be on that footage. Those were not the same man. And the question of how that gap had opened, and over how long, and through what series of choices, each of which had seemed reasonable in isolation. That was the question he'd been unable to put down since the first day he saw the footage in Strick's office. He opened the notebook, looked at the first blank page, picked up a pen. He wrote one line, "I did not see him." He looked at it. Then he wrote the next line. "That is the truth of what happened on Reynolds Road. I did not see him. I looked at that vehicle, and I made a decision about what I was looking at before I knew anything about what I was looking at. And everything I did after that was downstream of that first decision. Every escalation, every order, every piece of paper I filed out afterward that described the stop in language chosen to justify what I had already done rather than to describe what had actually happened." He kept writing. Not for Forsyth, not for the IG, not for anyone who would ever read it. He wrote it for the same reason he now understood Gaines had written in his notebook the night of the stop. Because a thing you refuse to name retains a power over you that a named thing doesn't. Because honesty, even in private, even in a notebook that no one would ever see, was the beginning of something rather than the performance of it. He wrote about the first time he'd stopped someone the way he'd stopped Gaines. Not that stop specifically, the pattern of it. The habit of looking at certain cars in certain places at certain hours and making a decision before the evidence was in. He tried to remember when that habit had started. He couldn't identify a single moment. It had accumulated, layer by layer, reinforced by the years that had passed without consequence, calcified by the certainty that consequence was for other people. He wrote about Strick, about the specific gratitude he'd felt across the years, every time a complaint disappeared, the gratitude that he'd mistaken for vindication. As if the disappearance of the complaint meant the complaint had been wrong rather than just buried. He wrote about the photograph, about the community event 4 years ago, about shaking Gaines's hand in a well-lit room with people watching and smiling in the uncomplicated way of an occasion that asked nothing difficult of anyone. He wrote, "I was capable of seeing him then. The circumstances made it convenient." He wrote, "I was not capable of seeing him on Reynolds Road. The circumstances made it inconvenient." He sat back, looked at what he'd written. The kitchen was fully dark now. He hadn't turned on the light. He reached over and turned on the lamp on the counter and looked at the pages again in the warm, slightly inadequate light. He didn't know what he was going to do with any of this, with the IG review, with his career, which was a question mark, whose answer he couldn't yet see the shape of, with Forsyth's advice, with the department and the colleagues and the specific texture of walking into a building every day where his name was now attached to a civil judgment and a federal referral. He didn't know, but he knew that not knowing was not the same as having no choices left. Gaines had been right about that. There was still time. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it. But he picked up the pen, and he kept writing.